out and speak to members. We don't have time to go out and speak to members of the community. So we're looking to you all to provide as much feedback as you can. The other thing I want to talk about is the bus situation on Friday. I want to apologize on behalf of the board and the superintendent for the incredible disruption that took place out in Lehigh. I will tell you that the day before the walkout, the superintendent and some of his staff had a very, very lengthy meeting with members of transportation and identified some problem areas that could be addressed fairly quickly. There are essentially two different problems. One is salary, and salary is negotiable and it is in the contract. So that cannot be dealt with expeditiously unless we go back to the bargaining table, and we will be doing that. The other thing that was of concern was working conditions. And some of the things you may have heard, problems with communications, restroom access, student discipline, student disrespect, access to technology, changes that have been made at the bus compounds that make life more difficult for them, training, and the use of masks. So in virtually every one of those situations, immediate steps are being taken to alleviate concerns and address discrepancies between one zone and another, one school and another, one compound and another. And the superintendent and staff continue to talk to transportation. I do want to mention, because there has been some press about the fact that there will be repercussions for staff. A sick out like this is a violation of the contract, and it is also a violation of state law. So at some point, the employees will have an opportunity to talk about their situation with staff, and depending on their, be held accountable, depending on their disciplinary records, there may or may not be meaningful repercussions. And I think, so I just want to encourage you that I think it was unfortunate that this flared up. I do greatly regret the inconvenience to parents and students, the confusion, et cetera. I believe we have everything on the table that we need to be talking about with this staff, transportation staff. So I think it should be smooth going from here on out. And those are my comments for now, unless there are questions.
Does anyone have any questions for Ms. Morgan? If you do, you may unmute yourself at this time and ask those questions.
Hi, this is Dr. Hawkins. I was just wondering, when you speak of repercussions, is that, or do you know of anything right offhand what they're going to be considering in terms of questioning the employees who actually did the sick out? Like, well, for instance, doctor's note or things of that nature.
Thank you for your question, Dr. Hawkins. I will tell you that the contract pretty much stipulates what the escalation of reprimands or documentation to the employee file will be recorded. If an employee file has nothing in it, so to speak, of a negative nature, then I think it will be fairly dealt with fairly straightforward. If employees have multiple disciplinary actions in the past, by contract, the staff and the employee are subject to certain understandings about how it will be handled. I don't expect it to be a problem, but I can't guarantee it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Board Member Morgan?
I do have one more question. I know that because of the shortage of bus drivers, any newly hired bus driver will get certain perks. And I was just wondering if that was the thing that tipped over this problem. When the present or current bus drivers feel that they are underpaid. Is that going to be a consideration when the board, not the board, the contract is dealt with, going back to the bargaining table? Is that going to be a consideration in terms of changing what the current employees get to match what they're giving the newly hired employees?
Well, I can't answer that question because you're absolutely correct. It has to go back to the negotiating table. I am aware that it has been a concern by some of the transportation employees. So guess I can be fairly confident it will come to the table. But as you know, we do interest-based bargaining. So there are interests that the district has in this matter, and there are interests that employees have in this matter. And they'll have to come to an understanding. But I do believe it's an issue, and I imagine, I can't guarantee, but I imagine it will be addressed.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, do we have any other questions for Board Member Morgan?
I have a question. Hi, this is Yvonne. With the children who don't have transportation in this type of situation because they don't have their own vehicles and that kind of thing. So is that this is an excused absence for the child or an unexcused absence for the child in light of the bus couldn't get them there? You know what I mean?
I can't answer that question about in a general way, because some kids may be excused based on where they were on the route and what was done on the route, and some may not. As far as I know, it will be treated on an individual basis at each school based on the situation.
Okay.
Ms. Morgan, I can answer that question. So
Thank you.
You're welcome. So schools were notified that morning that students who ride those buses who were unable to get to school on that day were excused absences, and that information was shared. So they will be held harmless for that particular day.
That's good.
Thank you.
Good to hear.
Any other questions for Board Member Morgan? All right, it looks like that was all of our questions, and we will move on to our next item agenda, which is approval of our minutes from the September 29th, 2021 meeting. I will tell you that I asked for a minor correction, that I had requested a motion to adjourn as opposed to making the motion to adjourn. I think it properly actually does reflect that the motion to adjourn was actually made by Chelsea Robinson. I just wanted to mention that for clarification. I don't know if anybody else saw any issues. I do want to point out as part of this that if you reviewed the minutes, you'll see that our staff did an excellent job of capturing the issues that were raised and providing responses. And on the ones that say they're still working on it, they will get back with us. And if there's additional information required, I think Dr. Spiro will follow up with them to see what exactly they need to know to make sure that we provide the correct information so that we can get responses. This is one of those things that I talked about at the first meeting, where very proud of the synergy that's going on between our committee and the staff, so that you see that there are, actual responses and things that are going on, so that your questions aren't just going into a vacuum. You can see the responses and how this then leads to actionable issues for the district to take action with. So with that said, I would entertain either a motion with changes or corrections to the minutes, or a motion to approve the minutes with the one correction I suggested.
Scott, this is Ann Ticka from Calusa Middle. I have one small correction.
Yes,
Would
ma'am.
it please be possible to correct the spelling of Calusa Middle for the attending middle schools on page 4 to CALOOSA?
Yes, ma'am. I'm sure if you would care to make a motion to approve with that correction. We'll make sure that Ms. Grimm corrects the typographical.
Okay, I
error.
make a motion to approve with the correction of Calusa's spelling.
Excellent. Do I have a second?
I have a, excuse me to interrupt. I have a change on the minutes, please, correction.
Yes, ma'am.
Right where it says DAC elections on page 1, it says that I, Grace Howell, am the representative for elementary, and Chelsea Robinson is the alternate. And it should be the other way around. I'm the alternate.
Okay.
Thank you.
So how would you care to second the minutes with your corrections so that then we could have discussion, see if there's any other issues?
Yes, I'll second that motion.
All right, so we have a motion and a second with a total of 3 corrections that have been suggested to the minutes. Does anyone else have any corrections or changes they believe are required to the minutes before they're approved? Seeing none, is anyone opposed to the approval of the minutes? If so, unmute yourself and say nay. Seeing none, the minutes are approved with the 2 or the 3 corrections as suggested, and we'll follow up with Dr. Spiro and Ms. Grimm to make sure that those corrections are implemented into the approved minutes as stated. That now takes us to the opportunity for any non-DAC members to provide public comment on any agenda items before us this evening, which is the redistricting going on in the county and the impact that will have upon the, or potential impact that will have upon the school board and the districts for the school board. So at this time, do we have any members of the public that wish to give comment on that? Seeing no requests for that, Dr. Sparrow, I don't know who's sort of heading up. I see a lot of names there. Is it Dr. Carlin being the first name? I don't know if they're alphabetical. I'm not sure who's taking the lead here to turn it over to.
I
Dr.
got you,
Carlin.
Mr. Hertz. I'm all set here, ready to go to share my screen. Good evening, everybody. And we are very excited to be here with you today. I'm going to ask Dr. Sparrow, since I can see him on here, if he'll show me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. All right, awesome. Thank you so much. So it is a privilege to be here with you this evening and to share with you a district initiative relative to redistricting. Before we jump into our presentation, I'd like to introduce you to our team who will be presenting alongside of me this evening. Mr. Jarrett Eady, who is our Director of Diversity and Inclusion, is joining us. So Jarrett, can you just say hello real quick?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having us.
All right, that'll help just so everybody gets to put the face with the name. Kathy Ebaugh, who is our planner. Kathy, can you unmute and just say hello? Good morning or good evening.
Good evening, all. It's good to be here tonight.
Thank you. We also have with us this evening our board attorney and general counsel, Kathy Dupree Bruno.
Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see you again.
Thank you, Kathy. And also we have consultants from Davis Demographics, David Cates.
Hi there, good evening. Thank you for having us as part of this presentation.
All right, and I believe Chris Melendez is also on the Zoom call with us this evening.
Yes, that's right. Pleasure to meet you all.
All right, well, thank you very much. So we have a rather full agenda this evening, and so we're going to go ahead and jump right into this presentation. Our agenda for this evening is going to include a variety of items related to redistricting. First of all, if you're like me, just a little overview probably would be in order to even know a little bit about what is redistricting and what are we even talking about this evening. So we're going to guide you through some introductory information. Then we'll take a little walk back in history and talk about the history of how we have conducted redistricting in our school district in the past. And Mr. Eady will provide that as well. We have our legal framework. We have some guardrails that we need to use as guideposts for our work with redistricting. So our very own general counsel and board attorney, Mr. Bruno, will walk you through that information. We do base the redistricting work on the most recent census, which was the 2020 census. And that will be walked through with our planner, Kathy Ebaugh, as well as Davis Demographics. Talk with you a little bit about map criteria, how we are creating maps and how we work with the county in reviewing some of that work. So we'll talk with you about those. We'll show you some of the maps that have been developed by the county. We are not required to go with the county's maps. We do have the ability to draw our own. So we'll talk with you a little bit about that as well. There is a proposed timeline that was alluded to earlier. We must, if we're going to do redistricting, it needs to happen in odd number years, and it needs to happen by the end of the year, which of course is December. So we'll talk with you about our timeline for our work. Talk with you a little bit about the choices relative to redistricting that await the school board in their upcoming meetings. And then we have a couple of questions for you all in your breakout session. So we will divide and conquer. That's why we have a fair number of team members. We'll divide out among elementary, middle, and high. We have some guiding questions we'll run through you for consideration and feedback. And then we will come back together as a group and you'll get a report out time. So that's our agenda. We're sticking to it. So any questions about the agenda? All right, so I'm going to turn it over at this point to Mr. Bruno, who's going to walk you through redistricting. So I'll turn it over to you, Kathy.
All right, good evening. So the one thing I think that's really important for us to understand is that pretty much every 10 years, the government does the census data, which is usually the basis of trying to understand where your population growth is and whether or not you do need to go ahead and redistrict. And the goal is always to try to have as close to an equal population distribution in your districts so that you can make sure that you secure and preserve the one man, one vote rule. And you do that by accomplishing your boundaries and no boundary change that would affect the residents' qualifications of incumbents, which basically means that if I currently have an incumbent in District 2, and then we're going to change that boundary, that person will be allowed to finish out their term of office, even if the boundary is changed in this odd year. So the other thing that I wanted to make sure that was clear is some of the basic statutory requirements that we have specifically for school districts. Even in the law, Florida Statute 1001.36, it's very important and it clearly states that the goal is to have equal population, be it if you have a 5-district seat or if you have 7 districts with 7 individual districts, or you have 5 districts with 2 members at large. You want to have your zones and your districts as equally populated as possible. The changes that need to be made have to be made during odd-numbered years, and that the boundaries, it has to be done through a resolution. So the board will go ahead and make a resolution that adopts whatever maps that they want to do. It has to be provided in a newspaper within 30 days. And then from there, it needs to be published at the courthouse, and then it needs to go to the Department of State. And the most important thing is to make sure that you do the boundaries. You can go to the next slide. The only other thing that I would add is a couple of other statutes. The election of the members obviously are by your constituents. And the other thing that's really important is even if a board member is elected from a particular district, they still have a statutory obligation to represent not a particular district, but a particular zone. They still have an obligation to represent the entire district. So that's just some basic legal framework from a statutory standpoint. And then we'll talk about some of the more particular laws that deal specifically with redistricting from a constitutional and a broader basis.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Pre-Bruno. We're going to turn it over to Mr. Eady at this time for a history or walk through history.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carlin, and good evening once again to everyone. In preparation for the redistricting conversation, district staff went back for the past 30 years to see how the school district has handled conversations related to the redistricting of board member residence areas. It's important to note in 1991, those individuals who were elected to the Lee County School Board looked at maps that were presented by the district staff. As our attorney alluded to, the board is allowed to consider and draw lines in odd number years. So after the response to the 1990 census, in 1991, the board went in the direction of receiving recommendation for alternative plans from the staff, and the plan that was finally adopted did not conform with the boundaries adopted by the Lee County Board of County Commission. It's an important notation in 1991. At that time, the School District of Lee County and its elected board representatives were representing at-large seats. So as alluded to by Mr. Bruno, the distinction between at-large and single-member districts in 1991, individuals who were running for school board had to reside in a specific residence area. However, all electors or voters in Lee County were eligible to vote for those individuals. By the year 2001, through the deliberation of the 2000 census, the School Board of Lee County did go ahead and modify the residence areas. And that year it was conformed with the boundaries established by the Lee County Board of County Commissioners. So what the conforming process meant, it simply meant that the lines that were drawn for the school board conformed or were the same lines that were established for the Lee County Board of County Commissioners. And between 2001 and 2011, the method of election was still an at-large system. That means that individuals who were running for the school board had to reside in a specific area. However, all voters across the county had the opportunity to vote. Another important benchmark year for our district was the year 2014. In the year 2014, our Lee County voters did vote to increase the number of school board members from the usual 5 members to 7. Along with that increase from 5 to 7, there was also the inclusion of 5 of the individuals being elected as a single member residence area. So more plainly put, if an individual ran in 2014, you had to reside in your specific area to be able to run, and only qualified voters or registered voters in that specific area or district were able to vote on that individual. And to balance out the numbers, 2 members of the board were elected at large. So that means all voters in Lee County were eligible to vote on those 2 at-large seats. So an important distinction to remember on that one in 2014, that was the year, though the lines were not changed based on where the residence areas were located. But the important distinction was in 2014, the voters of Lee County changed the composition of the residence areas to say that individuals running for the school board and elected to the school board, 5 of those individuals, of course, resided in a specific district or residence area, and all individuals only in that district could vote. And then the remaining 2 board members were elected at large by all voters. Okay, so we're going to go back a little deeper into some deeper conversation, Dr. Carlin.
All right, thank you, sir. Appreciate it. So we're going to turn it back to our attorney to walk through some additional legal information.
Thank you. So one of the things that's really important, in 1964, there was a United States Supreme Court case that it was Reynolds versus Sims that really explained what the opportunity is for voting. 1 person, 1 vote. And this is why we have that equal population, and to make sure that every person has 1 vote and that their vote counts. So one thing that it's really important in terms of what the Supreme Court is looking for. When you're looking at deviations from that 1% or from that one person, one vote, you're looking at no more than a 10% deviation, plus or minus 5, but nothing more than 10% is recommended in terms of a deviation from that equal population. So you want to be as equal as possible in that particular zone or that particular district. The other thing that's really important is there's always this balancing test in these types of cases in terms of redistricting when you're looking at all of the legal guidelines and guidances between the 14th Amendment, the 5th Amendment, and the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act is extremely important because this is the act that says that you need to be careful not to draw your lines in a way that dilutes or minimizes the strength, the voting strength of racial or other minorities. Next slide, please. And so it's really important when the court is looking to see what does that mean in terms of giving some guidance. And the reason that we need this guidance is because the 14th Amendment and the 5th Amendment, especially the 14th Amendment, says that you cannot use race to make decisions. So you have to be very careful. It cannot be the predominant factor when you're trying to redistrict a particular zone or an area. So the court came out with a case, it's called it's Gingell's test, and it basically lists some additional things that you should consider when you're looking to see if you're going to pass that legal muster and that delicate balance between the Voting Rights Act and the 14th Amendment. One is the existence, whether or not there is an existence of a minority group that is sufficiently large enough and geographically compact to constitute a majority in a single member district. Meaning, do you have a community of interest? And the other thing that they're looking for is, does this minority group vote the same? Are they politically cohesive? Do they act in concert on major issues? And then the last factor from the Gingell test is whether or not the white majority votes sufficiently to block or defeat a minority, the minority's preferred candidate. So those are the things that you're really looking for when you're trying to balance out that Voting Rights Act and the Second Amendment, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, as well as the 14th Amendment. Next slide, please. So we talked a little bit about the Equal Protection Clause, and that's where I think a lot of our litigation comes in when you're looking at redistricting, is that balance between the Voting Rights Act and the 14th Amendment and the 5th Amendment for congressional redistricting. Because again, the 14th Amendment says that you can't use race for your, or make that the predominant reason for your redistricting, but at the same time, you can't dilute minority vote. So the Gingell test is the one that gives us those factors so that we can take that into consideration. Next slide, please. So some of the things that you really need to consider when we're looking at the redistricting is a couple of things. Use identifiable boundaries. Board member residence areas must be drawn as nearly equal to the population as practical. Residence areas must be contiguous. So you want to try to use those natural boundaries as much as possible. When it's feasible, base it on existing districts. So if you can, try not to create some strange types of shapes and diagrams, et cetera, when you're looking at restructuring or redrawing your district. You want to try to keep it as contiguous and as compact as possible. And the other thing is, with regards to the Voting Rights Act, the board member residence boundaries should not unnecessarily divide areas of concentrated minority populations. So there are terms called cracking and packing. Cracking means that we have a minority population and we basically draw the districts to disrupt their strength in their vote. We're cracking them. And then there's others where you're trying to pack it and dilute it in that way. So there's all kinds of things that you're looking at to ensure that there's the balance. Now, race can be a factor that you do consider, but it cannot be the predominant factor. And let's see what else. Should take consideration of communities of interest, which we had just discussed. So when we go to the breakout room, we can discuss these legal factors a little bit more.
All right. So thank you very much, Attorney Dupree Bruno. We appreciate it. And we're going to turn it over at this point to David, who's going to walk you through some of the information relative to the census. And I will turn it over to you, David. David, you're on mute, I think.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Dr.
There you
Carlin.
go.
Yeah, there we go. Now you can hear me. And just for those of you who might not know who or my company or Chris and I are, we've been assisting the district for the last year and a half doing forecasting. And we're demographers for school districts. And this is an area that we, Chris and I, both work in for other states, mostly California, we're doing this. So what I'm going to be showing with you here and sharing with Kathy Eba are maps that the county has produced. So I'm going to give you a general overview of the process. I'll be in one of the breakout rooms, but I want to be clear, we as in Davis Demographics, the district did not make these maps. These came from the county, and they have their own mapping department, and they also have been vetted through their legal counsel. So this process is a two-part process. It's with the demographer to make the numbers balance, and then it's vetted through the attorneys to look at all those things that you just saw mention, all those items. So I don't want you all to get, when you see these maps, get daunted that all those things you're gonna have to check. A lot of it's kind of already been checked. These are just more looking at the different shapes and sizes of these areas, and if you have your own personal feelings when you see these areas. This screen, what you see on the screen here, this is your current board member boundaries right now. That's the colored shaded areas. There's 5 regions. And you could see the 2010 census numbers went right below the 2020. So every new census, these numbers have to be updated. So you could see, just looking on the screen there, that each of the 5 areas in 2010 were very similar, a little over 123,000 population. And I want to be clear on that. This is not by voters or certain age groups. This is total population living within each of these colored regions there. And then you can see 10 years later, the shift in population is pretty drastic. Some of the areas grew more than others, and it essentially made them a little more out of whack. And I'll show you on the next screen kind of what that entails. But you can see that the target there on the bottom right, the average we're looking for these 5 areas is a little over 152,000 is the average. So for example, District 4, just by coincidence on here, has about the exact average 10 years ago and about the same number now. So it just kind of fell in the proportional growth. And you can see in the bottom left corner too, we don't have them mapped, but you can see the names of your board members and the areas they represent, plus your 2 at-large members. So if you could go on to the next slide. And by the way, let me back up a little bit and say this too. The census data, because of COVID, there was a delay. And it was supposed to come out, I think around March of this year. And the information did not become available until I think August. So there was a 5-6 month major delay. And there is an end date, like Dr. Carlin mentioned, end of December, the boundaries have to be approved. So it's been a little more crunched in the time. So that's why we're presenting to this now. With the county recently got the data together and made these maps. And with the arrows I'm showing on here, this is essentially showing you what we call how far off the numbers are from the target, how much they deviate. And those arrows point to the areas that have grown the most or hasn't grown enough. And then when you see the actual difference from the target numbers, some are under 8,000, the target, some are above 8,000. Those are the indicators, essentially, that tells you you need to redistrict. If these numbers were closer to like about 1% plus or minus, then essentially the district could accept their current boundaries and move on. But those were the indicators to let everyone know that, no, we needed to look at new scenarios. Next slide, please. And then this is just a breakdown that the county did. This is your 2010 population on the right there with the newer census data on the left, broken down by the races and the ethnicity. you can see the differences there and what percentage they make up of the total population. So that's more of a benchmark for you to kind of look at and get an idea. These are exactly what your breakdowns of your county is right now. And we'll see how those get affected by these proposed boundaries. All right, then I'll take this part on as well. What the demographer does now, and like I said, these maps have already been done by the demographics department for your county. So they're doing this for the county commissioners, and they're also sharing it with the public and with all of us, so that if the school board decides they want to adopt these same boundaries, they've already done the work. They've done the heavy lifting. They've come up now, you'll see, with 7 scenarios and vetted it through their legal department. But what their main criteria they have to come up with is, it's very simple, really. It's just dividing the 5 areas as best you can into 5 equal population count areas. And I showed you that was roughly about the 152,000 level. The other part is, so you want to achieve that population equity, but also at the same time, as Kathy mentioned, you want to be contiguous. You don't want to have disconnected areas. You want them all to be together. And yet, just so you know, connecting through a bridge is still connected. Non-contiguous means completely separated usually. Compact is also, picture it like if you could draw a circle around one of these zones. It doesn't have to be a small circle, it can be a large circle. You want to avoid the elongated boundaries. And that's kind of getting to the third part there. You want to be careful that these are not, stretched for any particular favoritism. First and foremost, the job is to really, and also, you don't want to really have to make too many big alterations. There are some scenarios you'll see in here that are a little more drastic or dramatic with the current boundaries, but 2 or 3 of them are just a little bit of tweaks. That's it. And then everything balances. So there are some in here that are very similar to what your current boundaries are, but then you could check it with the data behind the scenes. As your attorney mentioned, we cannot use race or ethnicity when we're coming up with these boundaries. We're simply just looking at population counts. Once we get a scenario that balances, then we can check it with the information, the ethnicity and the race and others as well. Obviously, all those things your lawyer mentioned, they have to be in compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. And again, you remember, you will be the reason why it's every odd year is because not every odd year, but odd years are the years you make these changes, is because the even years are the years that voting occurs. So you want enough time that the representatives can finish off their term if they're changed. But every year you're going to be voting on at least 1 at-large member and possibly also 1 representing your district. All right. Kathy, Bob, do you want to talk about this or you want me to continue on? It's up to you.
You can continue, David, if there's questions or if there's something, I'll chime in.
Okay, and I also want to be clear too that, looking on whatever screen you're looking on, and you have an entire county here. It's hard to really know what are the streets, what are the dividing points. We totally understand that. When we go into the breakout rooms, some of us will have the opportunity to zoom in closely, especially all of you. You want to know where you live in relation to these boundaries. So we'll have the time, I think, to be able to zoom in, just get a quick visual yourself and maybe try to picture where you fall. This particular map shows you, it's called Alternative 1. The bottom right corner, you see the square mileage. It's the area that changes. So 112 square miles change. That's a pretty good amount changing. And the blue lines represent the outlines of your current boundaries. So you can see a little bit of exchanging between District 1 and 4, and some exchanging between the yellow District 2 and 4, and a lot changing between 5 and 2. But also keep in mind, some of these areas might not be heavily populated either. It might be a large area, but it might not really be much of a population. And then you'll get, as you go through these maps, as was mentioned, you try to want to go down major landmarks, highways, waterways as boundary lines. whenever possible. But again, we're trying to balance the population. So that's our goal really for mainly our top goal. The next map, please, or next one. So map 2, alternative 2, here, this one, there's more information, like I said, will be available during our breakout meetings. These show you also not only the bottom right corner, 14.63 square mile difference. That tells you right off the bat, this scenario is one of the least disruptive. If you look, there didn't have to be much changes to be made in order to balance the population. So those little areas, you'll see little tiny areas that have moved, and those are the ones that change it. The target, some of the differences from targets vary, but as I mentioned before, you're allowed a certain amount of variance. Something could be 1% or 1.2% off. It's still acceptable. It's when you get up to the 2, 3, 4, or 5% is what you try to avoid. So some of these scenarios you'll see up there in the bottom upper right, that the for District 5, it's about 1,700 below the target. It's still acceptable. Remember, these have already been vetted through the attorneys, so you don't have to really worry about checking all those boxes. You just have to find where you live, kind of get an idea and get your own opinions on what you see in these maps, what you like, what you don't like. Next one, please. The third one, again, I just keep pointing to that bottom right corner as the starting point. This one's about 92 square miles, so it's a little more dramatic changes. I'll point out the main difference between map 3 or alternative 3 is that it's not crossing over from the northern part of Fort Myers over to North Fort Myers in District 4. So this is the one of the few that has that change there. Most all of these changes, these maps have Lehigh intact so far. And then you can also look at the kind of the islands and how they fall in relation. They're kind of coupled with Cape Coral usually. In this case, they're actually also lower part of Fort Myers, Iona, McGregor kind of areas, part of that as well. Let me also just tell you right up front, because I know this is a fact, Cape Coral has too many people living in that city to be considered one zone. So no matter how you spin this, Cape Coral is going to have to be a part of at least 2 areas. You could kind of say the same thing about Fort Myers. It also is split up a little bit, but you know, it's a very large population. But Lehigh can probably take on a little more beyond its area. But I just want to kind of point out those things you might not know, you know, behind the scenes. So you move on to the next one, 4. Again, this one is really not much change from your current boundaries. If that's kind of the goal, is to keep it as close as where they were, this is one of the better ones. Again, a little bit of variation between the different areas, but again, acceptable variance, as we like to call it. And it kind of keeps the same boundaries that have been in place for the last at least 20 years kind of in place as well. Less disruption. Area 5, this one's has, again, this probably I think had the least disruption, if I remember correctly. There's a little bit of exchanging between District Area 1 and 4, and even less between 4 and 5. And I think there's a little bit down there in District 3 and 2 around, I don't know if that's San Carlos or Estero, that kind of region there. There's a little tiny bit of exchange, and now the numbers match up. So in 10 years, this shows that you could make a minimal change and still be compliant with the even distribution of population. Next. Okay. And by the way, I'm sorry, Dr. Carlin, I want to point this out, that there are 2 more maps that the county has recently adopted as possible choices as well. They might not be part of this PowerPoint, but we will be able to share those with you in the breakout sessions. One was, I think we might be talking about this in a little bit. One was a scenario that the NAACP had submitted, and the county went through that and added it, as well as one of the county commissioners added a map. They are part of the online maps that you can look through at your leisure. We'll be sharing those with the breakout session, but I wanted to point out there's actually a total of 7 maps.
And thank you, David, for mentioning that. Yes, we had to turn in our presentation prior to the adoption of that by the county. So yes, we will definitely pull those up in the breakout sessions. Okay, so thank you, David, very much. I'm going to take it from here. So as David mentioned earlier, the Census Bureau has released data very late this year due to COVID. Typically where we have, anywhere from a 9 to 10 month process has been condensed to 3 to 4 months. And as we mentioned before, obviously we can only redistrict in odd number years. So if we're going to do it this year, and like David just showed you the data, we feel we must, because our numbers are different. They're not, we have more of a variance in our population. So we do need to go ahead and redistrict this year. So what you will see here is a timeline that we have created in basically a couple of different scenarios. The school board does have the right to look at the county maps. And as David said, they have been vetted not only with their demographers, but also with legal. If the board makes a decision to go with one of the county maps, then we have a basic a time frame for which that will occur. Our next meeting with the board will be November 2nd, where we have a community group that is going to come present some information about redistricting to the board. That will happen November 2nd at 6 p.m. We will have a board briefing at 1 p.m. on November 3rd. And that's where we will ask the board to start to narrow down their options, and we'll share those options in just a moment. Because as David and I have both said, we have to work our way to December. December is magic time. That's when we have to make the decision. The school board needs to make the decision. And so every time we meet with the board, we're trying to get more information to the board. And also on November 3rd, we will continue to ask them to eliminate or reduce the number of maps that they're looking at. So if they do decide to go with the county maps, one of the county maps, then we will follow this time frame. In December, we'll go ahead and have a public hearing and then adopt the map at their action meeting on December 7th at 6 p.m. Should the board decide to create their own map, then we follow this column's timeline. So essentially, these two items are the same. November 2nd, community group presentation at 6 p.m., board briefing at 1 o'clock. If the board at the board briefing, they decide basically we're going to go with our own map, then we will get a ton of information from them at this meeting so that we can return to them on November 30th. Here's what you asked for. We'll present that map. There's opportunity at that board briefing on November 30th to provide any input the board has, and they can also receive public comment. And then we would bump their tentative agreement along with the public hearing back to, I believe it's December 14th. So that's where we stand as of today in terms of the timeline. So essentially, we're bringing to the board on November 3rd some decision points. One, will they adopt the county's map? So the county right now, as David shared, has 7 maps under consideration. The board does have an option to adopt their map. They may also say, well, I don't like map number X, whatever number that the county chooses. We like map Y, but it's still one of the county maps. The board could choose to do that. Or as I said, the school board might say, we don't like any of the 7, we're going to create our own map. So those are the 3 options before the board at this time. We have had a number of briefings with the board. I believe we have 2 and then a 3rd one coming up. So we've had some lessons learned basically from those, many lessons we've learned, but basically at the last meeting, like we said, one of the county commissioners brought forward another map that we will talk with you about in your breakout. And then also want to just remind you that community groups will be presenting at the board meeting coming up on the 2nd at 6 p.m. So you're certainly invited to join us or to tune in on Lee County Schools on our YouTube page so that you can view the meeting remotely. So here's the work that we're going to be doing in the breakout sessions, and we'll have these questions available for you in the breakout sessions as well. But here's where you can be extremely helpful, as Mrs. Morgan said. We're not going to have a lot of time to get out into the greater community to go to all the places that we would normally be able to do in a 9 or 10-month span. So we're counting on DAC and a couple of our other advisories to weigh in on these questions. So what we're going to do, there'll be pairs of us that will be present in your breakouts. And we have 3 questions that we would like you to consider. We're going to walk you through the maps, including the last 2 maps. And we're going to ask you just very quickly, based on where you live, what are the pros and cons? What do you see as pluses? What do you see as areas where you have concern? The second question is, what are those key geographic elements that board members should keep in mind as they determine, should we go with the county or create our own map? And we talked about some of those geographic elements. So we'll walk you through that question as well. And then, just like the board is going to do on November 3rd, are there maps that you are not recommending for the board's consideration? So you may have seen a map or 2 and went, no way, that map will never work. It's not the right thing to do. We'll provide that feedback within our breakout sessions, and then your facilitator will come back and report to the larger group. So it's our hope that we will hear from DAC. These are the maps that we absolutely don't want the board to consider. And then we know that these recommendations will be brought back to our board for their consideration. So we have 3 very robust questions that we're going to need some time. And so we look forward to joining you in the breakouts. So Mr. Hertz, we will turn it back to you, and we're ready for breakout sessions when you are.
We do have a few moments here. I don't know if anyone has any questions that I think are applicable, particularly on this subject, where I don't think it breaks down as much by grade levels as it does by geographic location of your schools. I don't know if anyone at this time would like to ask a question of our presenters in the general session before we go to breakouts. Do we have any such questions? I see Kelly Powell has raised her hand. Why don't you unmute yourself, Ms. Powell, and ask your question?
Thank you, Mr. Hertz. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. One question, of course, I think I probably speak for a lot of us when I say it's an enormous amount of information to try to absorb. But one of the things that I may have just missed, maybe you said, was in one of the slides there at the end where you indicated basically the 3 decisions that the school board will have. Yes, that one there. You have adopt the county's map. So of course they presented right now 7 options. When does the county decide their map? I didn't see that in the timeline, or maybe I just missed that in the timeline on the previous slide.
Yes, very good question. So we did not present the county's timeline because we're really on our own timeline, but we do have information about that. It is anticipated that the county will have their meeting. I believe they have a public hearing on November 2nd at 6 p.m. It is expected that they will come to consensus on the map, one of the 7 maps that they will be putting forward for adoption. So their timeframe is a little bit ahead of ours. They will come to consensus on November 2nd, and then they will adopt officially at their meeting on November 16th.
Okay, thank you. And is there any, for those of us that don't know much about this process, is there any specific pro or con about why the board would or would not want to adopt the map that the county adopts?
That's a good question. I don't know if anybody wants to grab it.
So this is Kathy Baugh, Director of Planning. I can speak for David and I, as we've talked about this a few times. The tightened timeframe that we're on this year does make it more beneficial for us if there is a county map that we think is suitable for the school district for us to use one of their maps. They've been working on this for a little bit longer. They've had a chance to really dive into the numbers, to really look at things. We've communicated with them some ideas. So I think that the thing for us is a consideration that we need to be mindful of, as we have until December 31st, which is not quite 2 months away, to adopt our new boundaries for the 21 year. And then after that, we are not able to touch the maps until 23. So I think that's a big pro of being able to work with the county's maps. It doesn't necessarily mean that we have to adopt the same county map. We may end up selecting something that's different from them, but I think we should give a lot of consideration to the ones that the county demographers have presented to us.
Okay, thank
David,
you. I have one last part of that. I'm sorry, I don't want to take up everyone's time, but I feel like it applies to everyone and not just the breakout levels. And that is just to see if I'm understanding right in this whole presentation, that the main things that we're looking for when recommending maps or making commentary about why a map might or might not be good, is that if the map, they're really all within the percentage that they should be of that 152,000 and change, but maybe how close are they to that ideal target, and then making sure that they don't, that they address those race and political concerns in terms of not either consolidating too much or breaking up too much a group or an area based on those considerations. Those are the main things, right? There aren't any other things why we would say something was or wasn't good?
Can I jump in here? I don't know if
Please.
someone else was
No, go ahead, David. Go ahead.
Let me make just some general statements. I made some of these earlier. There's different ways you could approach this. Like I said, all these maps, the numbers work. The lawyers have looked at it, but you have to, first you're going to see it, especially the other two maps you'll be seeing for the first time. You probably just saw these other 5 for the first time. It's what your impressions are. The district has had these boundaries in place, and the county as well, for the last 20 years. So if you really are of the approach where you don't want to change it too much, then you kind of know which maps you'll be leaning towards. However, I don't know if you want to look at just your particular area or where your schools are or where you live in the county, and just your knowledge, like the district staff and ourselves as demographers, we know your county pretty well. We look at the whole thing all together. If there's your communities, if you feel like one map breaks up a community too much for your liking, then put that aside and choose a different one. You each will have your own criteria. There's no really right or wrong answer here. And I don't want any of you to feel worried that you're going to be criticized or critiqued on your decision. We just want to hear feedback. That's really what this is. We've done a little bit of this with the board last week, and we'll get a lot more of it next week. But we're not presenting maps that are really out of whack. It's just you might have your own personal beliefs on knowing your county and your communities and how they are. As I mentioned, no matter what we do, we have to split up Cape Coral. But you might have different feelings about Lehigh or Lehigh Acres or Fort Myers or areas in the South. Those are the things you need to look a little more closely at and see if they're important to you. These are ultimately, don't forget too, the whole point of what these are. These are the areas that your board members will represent. They still have to have people come out and run for election and run and vote within these areas. So these have nothing to do with school boundaries per se or schools where they're located. It's just basically grouping like number of people, and then you add your own personal knowledge of your region or your county and give us what you think. That's all we're asking for.
If I may offer just one clarification, Mr. Cates, to Ms. Powell's question, I believe. The current maps were actually only 10 years old. I heard the reference point of 20 years. The current maps that we have now were changed in 2011. So just as a clarification, the current maps are only 10 years old.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, you did. Yes, last 10 years, every 10 years, I'm sorry.
I see that Mr. Walbert has a question, then we have one more, and then after that, we're going to go to the breakout sessions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Hertz. Just real quickly, so if the board chooses to draw their own maps, do they have any preliminary ideas for drawing their own maps with such a tight time frame? December 14th to December 31st, that leaves 17 days for the board to draw their own map. That seems kind of hasty. So do they have any preliminary ideas if they did make that decision to draw their own maps? And does that time frame for December 31st still stick?
Yeah,
So
great question. Go ahead, Kathy. You want to grab it?
If the board were to decide to develop its own maps, we would have a more detailed workshop with the board and ask them to use these maps as a preliminary discussion point and help us understand what about the maps do they want to see changed in their own. So we would still use these as a starting point and then build from there with the direction of the board as to kind of more detailed fine tuning as to what they would like to see in a map that they would create themselves.
And if I may, I'll add one thing to that. So our November 3rd briefing is just that. Our November 3rd briefing is, here's the information that we know about the county at this point. They'll have a sense about which map they're selecting. Here are the other county maps. And the third option is, here's the ability to create your own map. And from there, just like Ms. Seabaugh just said, if they say, nope, we don't like any of the 7 maps, here's what we'd like to do, then our hope is we would put a map up and do just like we're talking about tonight. What part of this do you like? What part of this do you not like? What do you always want to see in your map? What do you never want to see in your map? And from there, we would have November 3rd until the 30th of November to develop a map that would meet the needs of the school board. From there, once we have November 30th's map, there would be that opportunity again for the public to comment at that meeting. And then we would have a public hearing on December 14th, followed by the adoption of the map. So we do meet the deadline. It is tighter, certainly, but they would have approximately a month to draw the map.
And our
Other
last
questions?
Our last question in the general session is from Kathy. I don't even have a last name, but you had your hand up for a while.
Oh, thank you so much, Scott. Kathy Good. Well, I just, I don't know if I'm just clueless or if other people are thinking this. Does this involve busing, or is this just involving if we're going to have new school board members? Like if Cape Coral, there, it sounds like there has to be now 2 school board members. So I'm just curious on what the redistricting is. Is it just about having more school board members, or is it going to entail different busing and that part?
Yeah, so I can, do you want to take it, Kathy? Go ahead.
Just because, you've heard from David and Jared and I in the past on proximity, so I can understand where the confusion lies. The proximity project, as we call it, is the redistricting of the school zones. That is separate and different from this effort. This effort is strictly about legislative boundaries. This is about where our, who elects our elected representatives to the school board. This is not about student assignment or student attendance zones.
And with that said, it's time to go to our breakout sessions. And in each breakout session, there'll be one of our executive directors and one of the presenters will be there to facilitate the process of answering any other questions we may have and having a discussion to solicit feedback. So Ms. Grimm and whoever's assisting her, if you would kindly start moving people to the breakout sessions.
Kathy Ebel, what room do you want to go to?
I believe that I'm with Jared in high school.
Okay, you got it.
I know I'm with Jared and I think we're in high school.
You're in high school. Yes, ma'am.
Miss Dupuy Bruno?
She should be in middle.
Yeah.
Along with Chris Melendez from Davis Demographics.
He's in there. And then what about Mr. Edie?
He is with high school.
And then Dr. Carlin, which room are you going into?
Yes, ma'am. So David Cates and I are in elementary.
Okay, you got it.
Thank you, ma'am.
Anthony Rivera, do you want elementary, middle, or high school?
I am high school. I'm with Cape Coral Technical College.
Okay, you got it. Brent, do you want elementary, middle, or high school?
Elementary.
Miss Morgan, which room do you want to start off in?
High school, please.
You got it, ma'am. Christian Zimmerman,
High school, please.
Crystal Garcia,
Elementary.
Regina,
High school, please.
no, Jessica Peets, do you want elementary, middle, or high school?
Elementary, please.
John Paul, elementary, middle, or high school?
Middle school, Northport Myers Academy.
Melissa, elementary, middle, or high school? Amanda Sweeney, elementary, middle, or high school?
Erica, I don't know whether you heard me say high school or not. This is Regina Dureski. I'll be moved to the high school.
Okay, Regina, I did not hear you. Anna, elementary, middle, or high school?
Middle, please.
And then Amanda Sweeney. Gina Augustin,
High school, please.
Melissa. Melissa, do you want elementary, middle, or high school? Oh, I'm sorry, Melissa, you're muted. Hi, Kimberly. They just started their breakouts, elementary, middle, or high school?
I'm sorry, I was on elementary, but my phone cut out on me.
That's okay. I'm sending you there now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Carlin's asked for 10 more minutes, so we'll have to do 7:40. Is that gonna be able to work?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I think we have everyone back, or as much back as we're going to get. I know we had 80 before the breakout groups, and I see 75, so we may have lost a few, but that number looks to be static there. So we'll start forward with our breakout group reports, and we'll start with elementary school.
Okay, Chelsea, this is Grace Howell. I'm gonna represent the elementary school. Chelsea, if you can chime in on whatever I didn't catch. So to answer the breakout questions, which was what are the pros and cons of each of the county's maps? And some of us liked map 7 for the pros, clean lines that were drawn, definitive boundaries that were laid out. Cons for map 7, we said that District 3 now encompasses South Fort Myers. And then the Winkler extension being divided into 2 different districts. One side of it is in one district, one side of it is in another, might be a con, a problem. What are the key geographic elements that the board members should consider? We said socioeconomic areas may be an issue, something to consider. Just when you redistrict or redraw the lines, just to look at that, putting 2 affluent areas together may be an issue. The skew of the map 1 towards large racial areas may be something to take into consideration. And then this is question 3, are there maps that are not recommended by this group? We said no to map 6, which is the one that the NAACP is recommending, and that was due to not enough diversity across a district, because on map 6, the redistricting line, for example, for District 5, which is the Lehigh Acres district, it really, if you compare it to the others, the Lehigh Acres District 5 area really got, or looks or appears to be smaller, even though the population is similar. It now forces parts of Lehigh Acres to be put with part of Cape Coral, which some of our members felt was a huge issue when it comes to voting, and putting those 2 areas together may be a problem, even when you look at the racial impact of that. Chelsea, did you write anything else down? Oh, and then we also wanted to look at that area, Chelsea, I don't remember what area it was, one where we said, can we build on quarry land? Is it preserve the area
We were
to
talking,
the east of
right.
the airport?
We were talking over near the airport where the quarry is there. Some of that area changes in the maps. And when we were discussing, we spent most of our time talking less about the questions and having more questions of our own. But one of the questions that came up was, are we discussing future growth? And with that area consistently changing in several of the maps, you know, is there even building happening in some of those areas and some of it's protected land? So, but I would say we spent the majority of our time with asking questions and trying to understand better what the situation is, versus really being able to give deep feedback. And hopefully our questions will help build the feedback group.
And then just one last thing that I forgot to write down, even though it was me that mentioned it, but or it was I that mentioned it. We were also asking or looking at when the next vote is for the board members, which is 2022, and how the maps were considering redistricting based on where those current members live in those districts. And if we're going to be voting in 2022, if that should also be taken in consideration as far as like having the redistricting be based on that.
Is Miss Kathy Bruno still with us? Because I believe in our group that came up and we were instructed that if I understood it correctly, that is not allowed to be a criteria to be considered, the impact on sitting board members. But I would certainly defer to the board attorney or one of the presenters if they want to clarify that issue for everyone.
So what the statute says is that the current board member, even if you redistrict and you change their particular district, they will continue to stay in that seat until the next election. So if you have somebody who's up in 2022 and the district has changed, well, that will impact them. If you have somebody that's up in 2024, then it will not impact them until it's their election time.
But the question was, can it be can one of the criteria for determining the districts be whether or not it impacts a sitting board member?
So they do say that can be a criteria in terms of where your local, your current representative is. You can take that into consideration.
Okay, so then that's a clarification. So then I think what I heard was perhaps I misunderstood. So thank you for that clarification. So that is a criteria you can consider if an area loves their board member and doesn't want to see them displaced, so to speak. That's something they should take into consideration as they give their feedback to the school
Yes.
board.
Yes.
All right, and that would take us to middle school.
Unmuting myself here. Anna, feel free to jump in here also if I happen to miss something. So there's so much information, and I think we spent a lot of time asking some questions here too, but our focus, I'm going to answer all of the questions here that were to be considered just kind of all at once here, and morph them all together. So we said no pretty much to all of the other maps other than 5 and 7, and then spent most of the time comparing those two maps, and we were able to split screen those there and take a look at them more closely and dig into some of those areas. Map 5, we said as far as a pro, seems to have the smallest deviation from the target population goal and moves the least amount of miles in any direction on that map, also affecting the least amount of board members, it appears. One of the geographic elements, I guess, to consider was that looking at map number 7, there seems to be on the south side of that map, there's an area of pink. I can't remember what it's like, the Cape Coral, Sanibel Island area. And it goes all around the water side of Fort Myers. So just for those looking at things, just for visual people looking at an area that is drawn in one color, if any of you are looking at that map, there isn't anyone that lives there, that's water. So just taking a look at those maps and maybe moving some of those lines a little bit to just better represent the visual people. And then also we talked some about on map 7, it also seemed to distribute the city concentration in Fort Myers, in the city of Fort Myers area a little bit better. But that map does affect several board members, so that would be something to consider. And then also Chi and Grace posed a question there that we also posed right at the end, and that was if any of those maps, or if it could be considered in growing areas, that where if it is going to be considered in certain areas where the population is growing rapidly, like out in Lehigh and even out in North Cape and those areas. So we did get the answer on that the maps cannot be created based upon future growth. And correct me if I'm wrong in interpreting this, but that it can be something that is considered after the maps are created as we're looking at them.
Right. And then Attorney Hertz, if I may, just to add a couple of things, just to clarify, when you're looking at the criteria, I just want to make sure that everybody understands. Can you hear me? Using the identifiable boundaries, that's one thing in terms of criteria. Looking at maintaining those communities of interest with Justine just talked about in terms of the city of Fort Myers, basing it on your already existing maps and plans that you have. And of course, that equitable distribution is the most important thing. It's the main thing for the one person, one vote. Making sure that those districts are compact and contiguous. You can also consider keeping existing representatives in their district. And then of course, keeping in mind the Voting Rights Act.
or anything.
Mr. Bruno, did you have anything else to add? We had someone accidentally unmute, I guess, themselves, and I think one of our hosts has muted them now. If you had anything else to add.
No, I would just wanted to make sure that we were kind of clear on the criteria. If there's any questions, I'm here to answer it, but I wanted to share that with you.
All right, I'll make sure let's do the high school report, and then under good of the order, we could sort of see if we have any other further questions before we wrap up. And kudos to Mr. Eady. He had a tough job. His co-presenter had internet or computer issues. Our high school chair is having internet issues, and I don't think our alternate was with us tonight. And the high school chair asked, since Mr. Eady was both taking notes and presenting, he asked Mr. Eady would be so kind as to present a summary of what occurred in the high school, and I think he agreed to do so.
Thank you.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. If I may transition to our attorney, the chair mentioned conversation in our high school group relative to lines being drawn that would be in favor or in support to not discriminate a potential board member. And so that line, Ms. Bruno, was on slide 19 of the presentation. What was shared from my vantage point was that the line should not be drawn to favor an incumbent or to harm an incumbent, but I wanted to make sure that I was clear in that so that the guidance kind of goes back to what I shared in the group. It's a consideration fact, but line should not be drawn to favor an incumbent or a specific candidate or political party, as was presented in slide 19. So I just want to make sure, is that the correct information? Because that's what we shared in the group.
Keeping existing representatives in the districts can be a criteria.
Okay.
But you should not be drawing the line specifically for that.
Right. Does that answer your question, Mr. Chairman? I wanted to make sure it was clarified from what we talked about in the group.
Yes, it does. I think at least it's clear to me. You can see there's a little bit of tension between those two thoughts, which is why I asked her to clarify.
Okay. All right. Thank you, sir. So going back, facilitator, thank you so much for the kind words, Mr. Chairman. A lot of the conversation in the high school group centered on making sure they could have the street level access view. So I'll share a gee whiz fact or a helpful hint as provided by DeShonda in the high school group. Hopefully it can be shared in the chat. Once again, the county's maps are dynamic maps. If you have not had a chance to look at it, you can kind of go and zone in on a street level view to see where you all live specifically and how the maps would impact you as a voter, but not being tied to where your children or our kids are attending school. Much of the conversation in our group centered on the map offered by the NAACP, map 3 of the county, map 6, and also the map offered by Commissioner Hammond. The high school group had questions about any changes that drastically occurred from the last time the lines were drawn. It was discussed that one major change, as discussed by the NAACP, was the drawing of the central part of Fort Myers to be in a district and considered contiguous with the bridge with the parts of Cape Coral and North Fort Myers. And that was a conversation point. Moving on to the map offered by the NAACP, the conversation included concerns about the dilution of the vote in Cape Coral. The map offered by Commissioner Hammond received many folks who thought it was a favorable map because it kept, for as much as possible, parts of Cape Coral being connected, as well as the group saw it, alleviating some of the concerns offered by the NAACP. Additionally, there was conversation in the high school group relative to making it permissible for the board to consider using the maps that have been offered by the county. And the justification would have been that those maps have been vetted through the legal process. And as one person stated, based on their research and looking at the map offered by Commissioner Hammond, it is the map that does a pretty decent job of having an equal distribution of the population. At that moment, there were concerns about map A1 being the least amount of change. However, the committee went back, the small group went back and said, at least a few of the maps address some of the concerns that were addressed earlier with the pointed question offered by Lewis. What were the changes? And what were some of the things that people were considering advocating for the maps to be redrawn? The focus group for the high school did not come up with a decision relatively with a consensus of asking the board to go in one direction or the other, but there was much dialogue about using the maps as provided for the county. As the high school group said, for those who spoke, they felt like the maps that are presented does a good job based on their understanding of alleviating some of the concerns that they've heard from community as well as members of the group. So please feel free, any high school folks, to jump in, but that's what I have, Mr. Chairman, from the report.
Thank you very much, Mr. Edie. I really appreciate you wearing all those hats at the same time in the high school group. So thank you very much. With that, I think what we'll do is we'll move to good of the order. If anybody does, we have a few minutes, not a lot, but if someone has a specific question about something that's come up in the report outs here or the additional comments made by Mr. Bruno or the presenters, go ahead and raise your hand. We'll recognize you to ask a question in the good of the order prior to adjourning. Ms. Kelly Powell.
Mr. Hertz, I just wanted to make sure if I was understanding that this section, this good of the order, is only for questions and comments related to tonight's presentation?
No, ma'am. Technically, the good of the order is anything that affects the District Advisory Council. I was using my discretion to combine those two things, given that we only had a few minutes left. So you may, if you have a question about something that affects DAC that is not directly on tonight's topic, you may certainly raise it at this time.
Okay, I will be super brief then. I would love to see either before the next DAC or maybe at the DAC, the recent letter that went out this week regarding quality points for grade calculation at the middle school and high school level. It went out to all parents. It's a fairly significant change to the way grading and GPA is being handled at those levels. As a parent in the district for 14 years, I read that letter and was like, what? I don't understand half of it. And I have a lot of questions in terms of how students are impacted. And I just feel like that's an area that needs some additional communication for parents to understand it well. So I just wanted to bring that up for consideration.
Absolutely. I'll be sure that's raised at the executive DAC committee when we talk about topics. And Dr. Spiro, I'm sure, is the person who has the staff to address that issue. So we'll definitely put that into consideration.
Thank you.
Anyone else have anything? Ms. Howell has something for the good of the order. Oh, no. Oh, I said thumbs up.
That's a thumbs up.
I looked at it incorrectly. So that was Ms. Howell thinks that's a good topic for us to address. And Kathy, you have a comment for the good of the order.
Yes, I would just like to give a big shout out and kudos. If there's any school counselors here tonight, it is Red Ribbon Week. And speaking for our school counselor, I know all of them throughout the county have worked really hard to involve the students, and they have just done a phenomenal job. And our students are enjoying all the hard work the school counselors put into this week. So I just want to give a shout out to school counselors in the whole district.
Thank you very much. And with that said, I would happily entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll motion to adjourn.
Okay, Mr. Walburton, do I see a second there?
I'll second.
Okay, Justine Shaw, I said your name the way you read. Justine Shaw was our second for Ms. Grimm. And anyone opposed? Seeing no one opposed, I will see everyone at our next meeting, which will be November 17th. November 17th is our next meeting. Look forward to seeing everyone then. Thank you.